Well, the last video I posted was in August last year, so that's quite a gap, really. There have been a few reasons for that, nothing particularly bad or tragic or anything like that, but just circumstances have made it difficult, if not impossible, for me to get the necessary work done into making videos and uploading them. But hopefully things are clearing up now, and here we are again. New year, new load of videos, I suppose.
Now, I was reading something the other day, people discussing why we do all this sort of stuff, and they came up really with 3 reasons, and I think it was a good set of reasons why we get involved in seeking out and maybe bringing back to life old technologies. One of them being the actual novelty value of something, the rarity of it, the fact that it's something you just don't see nowadays. I've certainly got a few sets like that, and I have to say that's not the thing that always gives me the most pleasure, apart from actually looking at the thing, maybe getting it working, playing with it for a day or so, but then after that I tend to just put it away. The other is the thing of being able to buy now the sort of things that in your youth you couldn't afford, and certainly the sort of things like Grundig's, Hackers, and to some extent Robert's radios fall into that category. And then the other thing that whoever it was said was that there's also the thing about stuff that you used to own that you don't own anymore. Maybe you got rid of, you didn't think you needed it again, you got something nicer and better. But now you'd like to go back and revisit that. And this pair of things, I know you can see only one here, that we're looking at today, fall into that category. Now this is a Pioneer receiver from right at the beginning of the 80s, I think, or right at the end of the 70s. And I had one of these. In fact, I'm not sure if it was exactly this model I had. I think I might have had the model below it, which this is the SX700L. I think I might have had the 600L, which was slightly lower power and didn't have as many presets. But in any case, there's very little difference between the two. And it's a 3-band tuner amplifier, or receiver, as we tend to call it in those days. And I always liked it. I always liked the sound of it, and I always liked the nice little coloured LEDs, which for the time, you know, looked a bit high-tech. Now this one didn't actually cost me very much, and it was sold as having a fault on the right channel, but a bit of cleaning up of switches and things proved that wasn't really anything serious, so I was quite pleased to get it back again. Now one of the interesting things about it is this little dial here. This is actually the only bit that's illuminated on this scale, which is not entirely true. If you put it into manual mode, so if you put the tuning into manual mode, you'll see here there's like a little fibre optic at the end of the thing. So there isn't exactly one of the old tuning pointers on a band. There's a fibre optic cable that goes on the end of it, and you can just about see that moving around there across the scale. And then while you're doing that, this meter, when you're in manual mode, is like a tuning strength meter. So yeah, you can see it peaking there as I hit onto a station. Now when you've got a station you like, you can press memory and store it into one of these presets. When you press one of the presets, what happens then is that this converts from being a signal strength meter, which is the thing along the bottom, into being the frequency indicator. So it's got long wave, medium wave and FM there. I'll just show that in close-up for a moment. And you can see that as I change the preset, it moves it along to whichever point in the band it's supposed to be at. Now I thought we'd have a little sidebar here about how all this works, because I thought it was quite interesting the way they'd done it. You'll see here that instead of the usual variable capacitors that you have in tuner, you've got these varicap diodes, and these are driven obviously by voltage, which is generated by this potentiometer here, which is the tuning control. So the tuning control is actually just a variable resistor. Now you can see that all goes through this circuit here, this integrated circuit, which then processes it and turns out a voltage at the other end to drive the varicaps. So that's when it's in manual mode. In addition to that, you can see there's a 10-bit register here, which goes through this ladder D to A converter. I'll switch to the block diagram because that makes it a little bit clearer how it works. So, as I said, when you're in manual mode, the voltage from the pot is just passed through, but also what happens is there's a comparator which looks at the voltage out of the pot, compares it to the voltage found by converting the 10-bit value to analog, and then nudges the counter inside the chip up and down to track where the potentiometer is. Now when you press the store, all it does is it takes the value out of that counter and stores it in one of the memories. When you press one of the preset buttons, it just recalls the value from that memory, turns off the manual thing and the comparator and everything, and converts the digital output of that into the analog voltage that you'd stored at the time, and sets the frequency via the varicaps. So an interesting combination of digital and analog technology there. Now, to be honest, I don't use the tuner section of this a great deal. What I do is route the output of my audio mixer into the aux input here, and I use my digital radio most of the time to listen, and occasionally I will use this, but it's not brilliant in terms of reception. It's not one of the most sensitive things ever, but the sound of it is pretty good, so I do use it as my amplifier with my speakers in this room, and I've been very pleased with it. When I originally had one of these, I eventually replaced it with this Audiolab 8000, which again I still have. The Audiolab 8000 was a much higher end piece of kit, and I think it cost me nearly a month's wages when I got it. And I always convinced myself that the Audiolab was a massive step up from this. And now that I've got this back again, it doesn't sound to me like it's as massive a step up from it as I thought it was, although I think it is actually better in some ways. Obviously my hearing has declined quite a bit over 40 years, so that wouldn't really help in making an objective comparison. But certainly the Audiolab, I can tell you, doesn't compete in any way with the build quality of this thing. Now, this wasn't the only piece of Pioneer kit that I had at the time. I also had a Pioneer cassette deck, and I've been looking around for one of those at a reasonable price as well. One of the things you'll find is this 1970s and 1980s hi-fi amplifiers are really going for rather stupid prices now. So if you see one at a decent price, it's worth picking one up, because it may be possible to fix it without too much trouble, as indeed it was with this one. But you have to wait a while and not just dive in and pay the £200 that some people are charging for them, which is more than they cost back in the day. Obviously not adjusted for inflation. So I also found myself a Pioneer CT200 cassette deck, and, well, here that is. It didn't come like this, I have to say. It was much more nicely presented when I got it, but it was labelled as not working, so I had it apart. And the reason it wasn't working, as far as I can tell, is because the belts had gone, because when you started it up, you could press the buttons and things, but nothing actually happened. So I spared you all the pain of taking it apart, but I took out the mechanism here. And really the mechanism all works off 3 belts which come off the motor assembly, one of which goes round here and operates the essentially the real hubs. So these 2 solenoids here put it into fast forward or rewind. This big flywheel here is obviously the thing that does the capstan motor and the head lift, and that is another belt. And then there's another belt which comes off the end here and drives this mechanism. Just have a look here, which is the old tape counter. So you can see we have the old mechanical tape counter here, and that's driven off a belt from the mechanism. The interesting thing though is that although it's got a mechanical tape counter, on the back of the mechanical tape counter here is an optical sensor. So that converts the spinning of the mechanical tape counter via this thing. There's vanes on this and a photodiode, and that converts it back into pulses again, so that the auto stop mechanism can tell whether or not the tape is actually moving. Now this is a really nice mechanism, I think, but one of the problems is that at this age, when the belts all go, they tend to dissolve in some horrible sticky black goo, and it gets absolutely everywhere. So I've had to do quite a bit of cleanup on this, and also when you get the black stuff on your hands, it takes like days to get it off. Unless you use chemicals and things, which obviously I don't want to use on my delicate gossamer-like skin. Anyway, I've done all that. We've now got to the stage where I could put the belts back on. I was going to have a look and see what I had in stock, but I have actually been able to buy a set of belts off eBay for it. So hopefully that set of belts will work much better than anything I can find from my stock. And we'll put those on, put it back together, and hopefully it'll start working. Right, now I've got the belts back on, but in the process of removing the motor carrier, I seem to have detached the wires from it, so I do need to check where these go to make sure I get the plus and minus the right way around, otherwise it's going to go backwards presumably, or burn out in a spectacular fashion, completely trashing the whole unit. Now I can see that these white and black wires go back down here to the board, in fact to these two pins here, which are numbered by the looks of things 7 and 9. So if I look on the circuit diagram, I just need to see which of 7 and 9 is positive and which is negative. So yeah, look at the circuit diagram, shows that 7, which is the black one, is negative, and 9, which is the white one, is positive. Yeah, well that went considerably worse than I'd hoped for. I've got the thing back together, got the belts on, put the wires back on the motor, and they definitely were in the right order. Plugged it back in, switched it on, and this fuse here in the motor supply circuit blew, and nothing happened after that. So I replaced the fuse and checked if there was any short circuit, which I couldn't find. I had a look at the motor, but it just wouldn't go round no matter what voltage I applied to it, so I don't know what's happened there. I've had it apart, I can't see anything obvious, can't see any shorts, but in any case it seems to be open circuit now. So we're talking a bit of a gap here between when I recorded the last video segment and when I did this one, because I had to get myself another motor, and I was somewhat disappointed at that point, so I thought, oh, you're never going to get another one of those, and indeed they don't make that motor anymore. But having waited a couple of weeks, because it was just before Christmas when I was doing that, I have got a motor which is supposed to be a drop-in replacement for it, which wasn't very expensive, only a few quid, so I'm going to put that in and see if that improves matters. Okay, so I got it back together, I got the belts on, the motor is now running, but when I press play, we get a horrible noise. It's like fast forward and rewind are working. It stops after a while on those because the belt that drives the little motion sensor isn't working, isn't connected at the moment obviously, so it will auto stop. And I've realised that I made another massive mistake here. And when I looked at it and looked at which way the capstan's going, it's actually going the wrong way round. And it's only at that point that I realised that this motor that I got, there are actually two versions of it. And if we look a little more closely, you can see that this one is labelled as CW for clockwise, and we should have had the CCW one, which is counterclockwise, which is what capstan motors, the direction that capstan motors are supposed to go in. So let's order another motor and try it again. You might wonder at this point, why don't I just reverse the motor connections and then the motor will go the other way round? That is true, but if we look at the circuit diagram again, we'll see that the wire for the negative side is actually earthed, and the can of the motor is also bolted to the chassis, so if you did that you'd short out the motor drive circuit. It would of course be possible to put a few isolating plastic bits in and things like that, although that feels a bit skanky. Also, I think it may be the case that screening the motor to earth is quite important from the point of view of not creating interference with the record and replay head, which is going to be quite sensitive, which is in its vicinity. Right, well I've now reassembled it with the correct motor, which has arrived, and it's back working again. I'll just turn that down a bit before we get a copyright strike. It's got, obviously I haven't put the front and everything on it. I have cleaned up the transport and aligned it as far as I can. I found it very difficult. There is a little screw at the back of the motor. This is the wrong sort of motor that we had before, but essentially there's this little screw hole at the back of it where you can adjust the speed, but I found it very fiddly and very difficult to get it dead on the right speed. But it's close enough that you wouldn't really hear it, probably about 20 or 30 hertz out. And having measured the wound flutter, it appears to be around 0.08% or 0.1%, whereas it should be 0.05. I'm not entirely sure why, even though it's an old machine, that it's that far out, because we've replaced the belts, the transport doesn't look particularly worn, the motor is electronically servo driven, so I'm not sure why it's so far out really. Maybe the motor is just not as good, maybe the new replacement motor isn't as good as the original would have been. But again, it's not the end of the world. It sounds okay on most music. Some classical piano music, you will definitely hear it. But overall, it seems to be working again. So I am going to put it back together, put the front panels and everything back on it, and we'll have a final look at it once it's in place.
I love joining in with the oi! There's Blur's Park Life, Cambridge's Star Radio, where Craig has Star's awesome 80s lunch hour next. 60 minutes from the most colourful decade for music. Have a great weekend.
The sound of the city. Star Radio.
Moon's Toy Store's huge sale is now on, with lots of price reductions on... Hey, there's Blur's Park Life, Cambridge's Star Radio, where Craig has Star's awesome 80s lunch hour next. 60 minutes from the most colourful decade for music. Have a great weekend.
The sound of the city. Star Radio.
Moon's Toy Store's huge sale.
Well, there we go, it's all done. It's quite nice to have this stacked back together. It takes me back about 40 years when I last had this combination of units. And I really think they're both quite high quality for the price that they were at the time. They weren't at the... They probably both have been seen as the bottom end of the market, really. But I find the sound is fine. I have a little bit of concern with the wow and flutter on the cassette deck. And that only really shows itself, as I said, on certain programs in terms of audibility. I'm not sure how much I can really do about that. I think one of the design flaws of the cassette deck is the fact that the motor is running all the time that it's switched on. And that no doubt contributes to the fact that the motor suddenly turned up its tail, though why it did it just now, I'm not sure. Anyway, having had that replaced, it's okay. There are a few scuffs and marks on these things, as you might expect. The main thing is this little cover for the cassette door was on it. A lot of the ones I'd seen that wasn't there, which really spoils the look of it. Also, this power switch is a little bit... The switch itself is a bit... or the handle is a bit loose. But the switch itself is functional. I do like the clunky transport, the solenoid operated transport, and that has obviously survived a lot better than other stuff of the time, which was all piano keys and mechanical bits and bits of plastic that broke and fell off. And it's got quite a clever mechanism for implementing this, but I think, again, the mechanism depends on the motor running continuously. You've got to make sure you switch it off when you're not using it. And I do like these proper VU meters with the mechanical movements rather than those dancing lights that you tend to get on stuff that's not much newer than this, to be fair. So overall, a successful conclusion to a nice bit of nostalgia. At one point I wasn't sure whether we would get it over the line, but we did. I'll see you on the next one.